He built castles that touched the clouds, dreamed of gods and heroes, and filled Bavaria with beauty that defied reason. But on one silent June night in 1886, King Ludwig II of Bavaria was found dead in a lake, floating face down in shallow water beside the lifeless body of his doctor. The official story claimed it was a tragic accident. Some said it was madness, others whispered murder, and more than a century later, no one truly knows what happened on the dark shores of Lake Starnberg. They called him the fairy tale king, a ruler who preferred art to war, beauty to politics, and fantasy to reality. To some, he was a visionary. To others, a lunatic. To himself, he was simply a man born in the wrong world, one that punished imagination, emotion, and desire. He loved music, moonlight, and solitude. He built palaces that seemed carved from dreams, places so magnificent they still seem impossible today. But behind the marble and gold lay something far darker: debt, betrayal, and a secret that could destroy a dynasty. Rumours followed him everywhere, whispers of forbidden love, eccentric knights, and royal defiance. He refused to marry, he spoke to ghosts, and he surrounded himself with beauty in a world that demanded conformity. This is the story of King Ludwig II of Bavaria. Ludwig Otto Friedrich Wilhelm was born on August 25, 1845, in Nymphenburg Palace near Munich. From the moment he entered the world, it was clear that this was no ordinary child. He was the heir to the Kingdom of Bavaria, destined for power, duty, and public life. But from his earliest days, Ludwig wanted none of it. He grew up surrounded by wealth and privilege, but raised in a home cold with formality. His father, King Maximilian II, was a serious man, more philosopher than father, who believed that discipline built strength. His mother, Queen Marie, was warm but distant, distracted by her own interests and travels. The young prince spent much of his childhood alone. While his younger brother Otto played outdoors and mingled with tutors, Ludwig often retreated into his imagination. He devoured stories of knights, heroes, and gods. His favourite tales were the Germanic legends that later inspired his greatest works, stories of loyalty, sacrifice, and doomed love. The walls of Hohenschwangau Castle, where he spent most of his youth, were painted with murals of medieval myths. Young Ludwig would stand before them for hours, memorizing every detail, lost in the colours and the silence. To him, these knights were real. Their honour and beauty felt more noble than the politics and hypocrisy he saw around him. His teachers noticed early on that he lived in a world of his own making. He preferred art and music over military studies and poetry over protocol. He rarely laughed, but when he did, it was soft and fleeting, as if joy embarrassed him. He could recite entire passages of Schiller and Goethe by memory, and by the age of 10, he was already writing romantic verses of his own. He was tall, strikingly handsome, and graceful, but also shy and painfully self-conscious. Court observers described him as beautiful but strange, a boy who seemed to belong to another era. When he wasn't wandering through forests alone, he stood at his window late at night, watching the moon rise over the Alps, dreaming of a life beyond the expectations of his birth. Even then, Ludwig seemed haunted by something unspoken. Some believed it was loneliness, others sensed a deeper sadness, the feeling of being different in a world that demanded sameness. He loved deeply and quietly, but he could not express that love openly. His relationship with his strict father was distant at best. King Maximilian saw his son's imagination as weakness and tried to harden him with military training. But Ludwig hated the drills, the shouting, and the rigid uniforms. When his father scolded him for lacking discipline, Ludwig reportedly replied, "I am not made for war. My kingdom is within." It was a strange answer for a crown prince, and it worried everyone around him. By his teenage years, Ludwig's fascination with art had become all-consuming. He developed an obsession with Richard Wagner's operas, which told stories of divine love, betrayal, and redemption. Wagner's music was everything Ludwig longed for: beautiful, tragic, and transcendent. He often rode for hours through the countryside with Wagner's melodies echoing in his head, imagining himself as the heroes of those epic tales. But when he returned home, the real world felt dull and suffocating. When his father died suddenly in March 1864, Ludwig was only 18. Overnight, the dreamer became a king. Bavaria rejoiced. The young monarch was tall, elegant, and impossibly handsome, the image of a romantic ruler. His people adored him instantly. Newspapers called him the Fair Prince. Women swooned at the sight of him on horseback. Artists praised his refined taste. But behind the perfect image was a terrified young man who had never wanted to rule. The same imagination that made him beloved by the public made him ill-suited for power. He understood beauty, but not politics, and soon his dreams would collide with the harsh realities of the world he was forced to lead, because the young king was about to meet the man who would change his life forever. In March 1864, Bavaria changed forever. King Maximilian II was dead, and his 18-year-old son Ludwig suddenly found himself on the throne. It was the moment every royal was born for, but Ludwig was not like other kings. As he stood in front of his people for the first time, the crowds erupted in cheers. He was tall, graceful, and radiant, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to hold both sadness and light. Bavaria had not only gained a monarch, it had gained a symbol of hope. For the first time in years, the people of Munich felt proud. The newspapers called him the Dream King, a title that would soon prove prophetic. They believed the young ruler would usher in a new age of art and enlightenment. At first, Ludwig seemed determined to meet their expectations. He spoke softly, but with conviction about his desire to bring beauty and culture to Bavaria. He freed political prisoners, restored civil rights, and ended strict censorship. These acts earned him admiration both at home and abroad. But even in these early days, it was clear that Ludwig was different. He hated court ceremonies and public appearances. He avoided military reviews and preferred to hold meetings at night, often by candlelight, surrounded by paintings and music. Ministers whispered that their king was too gentle for politics, too emotional for strategy. While his advisors debated taxes and treaties, Ludwig was dreaming of something else entirely: music, art, and legend. And that dream would soon take form in the person who would define his reign and his fate. In May 1864, just 2 months after his coronation, Ludwig sent for a man he had idolized since childhood, the composer Richard Wagner. Wagner was already famous and infamous across Europe. His operas were revolutionary, his debts enormous, and his personality impossible. He was brilliant, arrogant, and controversial. When Wagner arrived at the royal palace in Munich, the two men met for the first time. Ludwig was mesmerized. Here was the living embodiment of everything he loved: genius, beauty, and art elevated above politics and power. Wagner, in turn, was captivated by Ludwig's devotion. In the young king, he saw not just a patron, but a kindred spirit, someone who understood his music not as entertainment, but as revelation. Ludwig immediately offered to pay off Wagner's debts and fund all his future work. He gave him a lavish residence near the palace, a private carriage, and access to royal funds. To the horror of his ministers, Wagner became Ludwig's closest companion and most trusted advisor. Their relationship soon became the talk of Europe. Letters between the two were filled with affection, poetry, and longing. Ludwig called Wagner "my friend, my saviour, my dearest." he signed his letters in eternal love. To modern eyes, the bond between them feels deeply romantic. Whether it was ever physical remains uncertain, but to Ludwig, it was love in the purest sense. Wagner represented the world he wished to live in, passionate, creative, and unashamed. But their closeness was a scandal waiting to happen. The court despised Wagner, seeing him as a manipulative foreigner exploiting the king's infatuation. Conservative nobles spread rumours that the composer held a dangerous influence over the monarch. When Wagner's arrogance grew unbearable, the ministers took action. In 1865, barely a year after their meeting, they forced Ludwig to send his beloved friend away. The king was heartbroken. He wept openly and withdrew from public life, spending nights alone in the palace, reading Wagner's letters and playing his music in the dark. For Ludwig, it was the beginning of a lifelong pattern, reaching for beauty, losing it, and retreating further into fantasy. There had been someone who truly understood him, Paul von Thurn and Taxis. Paul was a young nobleman from one of Germany's oldest and most powerful families, charming, confident, and strikingly handsome. Appointed as one of Ludwig's close military aides, he quickly became the king's favourite companion. Their friendship deepened almost instantly. They took long walks together, spent nights talking by candlelight, and exchanged letters filled with affection and devotion that went far beyond friendship. Paul wrote that he would only be happy if he could live for Ludwig, remain faithful to him, and stay by his side. In another letter, he told the king that their friendship had changed, that it was no longer youthful affection, but a bond between men, something sacred and unbreakable. For a time, the young king was happy. He had finally found someone who made him feel understood, even loved. They travelled together, shared poetry, and spoke in a private language of tenderness and trust. Ludwig, in his diaries, called their time together beautiful hours, writing about their walks arm in arm through the gardens of Hohenschwangau. Whether their relationship was romantic or simply deeply emotional, no one can say for certain. But their closeness was undeniable. In an age ruled by religious morality and political control, even love unspoken could destroy reputations. And in the end, it did. By 1866, whispers began to circulate through Munich's court. Some said Paul had become too bold, too comfortable in his influence over the king. Others suspected jealousy and political manoeuvring from those who despised Ludwig's sensitivity. Whatever the reason, their friendship suddenly ended. Ludwig dismissed Paul from his service and refused to see him again. Heartbroken, Paul begged for forgiveness. In his final letter, he pleaded that he never meant to hurt the king and could not bear life without his friendship. But Ludwig remained silent. The bond was broken. Paul left Bavaria in disgrace, taking the name Paul von Fels after marrying a Jewish singer named Elise Kreutzer, a scandal that cost him his title and his inheritance. He died young, consumed by illness and sadness. Ludwig never spoke his name again, but those closest to him said he was never the same. To the outside world, Ludwig's heartbreak looked like eccentricity, but behind the walls of his palaces, grief became obsession. He buried himself in Wagner's music and the fantasy worlds he built from stone. Yet the pressure to marry grew unbearable. Bavaria needed an heir, and the church demanded its king behave like one. Reluctantly, Ludwig agreed to an engagement with Duchess Sophie Charlotte in Bavaria, the younger sister of Empress Elizabeth, known as Sisi. Sophie was intelligent, cultured, and adored music just as much as Ludwig did. For a moment, it seemed the match could work, but the engagement dragged on for months as Ludwig delayed the wedding again and again. He wrote to Sophie saying his heart belonged to another world, and finally ended the arrangement with a small ring and a note asking for forgiveness. He confessed, "I am not made for marriage." After breaking his engagement with Sophie Charlotte, Ludwig's heart drifted further into solitude. His grandfather had once told him, "No woman alive could resist you." It was true in appearance. His tall frame, dark hair, and piercing blue eyes made him one of Europe's most admired rulers. Yet emotionally, no woman ever truly reached him. The only woman who ever seemed to touch his soul was Empress Elizabeth. To Ludwig, Sisi became the living symbol of everything he worshipped: beauty, melancholy, and defiance wrapped in grace. He once called her the angel who walks through a corrupt world untouched. But even she could not reach the part of him that longed for something he could never admit. His relationships with men, though hidden beneath silence and discretion, revealed the truth of his heart. After the painful loss of Paul von Thurn and taxis, Ludwig found comfort in his loyal riding master, Richard Hornig. Hornig was patient, protective, and always at his side, the one person who could calm him when his moods grew dark. For years they shared a quiet companionship that was more than duty, but less than peace. When Hornig eventually married, Ludwig felt betrayed and withdrawn. Another thread to reality had snapped. Then came Joseph Kainz, the young actor whose beauty and brilliance captivated the king completely. Ludwig adored him, showering him with gifts and invitations to perform privately at his palaces. He saw in Kainz not just a performer, but an embodiment of everything he idealized: youth, courage, and purity. Together, they rehearsed scenes from Wagner's plays and spent long evenings in conversation. But as always, Ludwig's love was overwhelming. His adoration frightened Kainz, who eventually distanced himself. The king was devastated. Every person Ludwig loved became a reflection of his own unreachable ideal, too perfect to exist, too fragile to last. When reality failed to match his imagination, he escaped deeper into the dream world he could control. Ludwig poured all of his passion, grief, and loneliness into something the world could not take away from him: his imagination. If the world refused to accept his dreams, he would carve them into the mountains of Bavaria. It began with sketches on parchment, lines of towers and turrets rising toward the sky, filled with bridges, murals, and grand halls that looked like something from a myth. Those drawings became blueprints, and soon blueprints became palaces. His first masterpiece was Neuschwanstein Castle, a vision of medieval chivalry and Wagnerian legend perched high above the village of Hohenschwangau. The location was no coincidence. He built it near his childhood home, on the same hill where he had stared at the stars as a boy and imagined being a knight of the Grail. The work began in 1869, and from the very first stone, Ludwig was obsessed with every detail. He chose the colours of the murals, the designs of the tapestries, even the shapes of the door handles. He ordered that the castle's halls should feel like the inside of a dream, filled with scenes from Tristan und Isolde and Parsifal, his favourite operas. When his architects tried to cut costs or simplify designs, he dismissed them. "You are building not for now, but for eternity," he told them. He wanted the impossible, and he would have it. The project consumed him. He visited the construction site at night, lit by torchlight, riding up the mountain to oversee progress while the rest of the kingdom slept. It was said that he preferred moonlight to sunlight, that he found it softer, more forgiving. Workers began calling him the Moon King. But Neuschwanstein was only the beginning. Next came Linderhof Palace, built in a quiet valley surrounded by forests. If Neuschwanstein was a monument to legend, Linderhof was a celebration of pleasure. Small but impossibly ornate, it shimmered with mirrors, gold, and silk. It was modelled after the Palace of Versailles, home of his idol, King Louis XIV of France. Ludwig adored the Sun King, not for his power, but for his theatricality. He saw Louis XIV as the perfect symbol of beauty elevated to rule. Linderhof became his sanctuary. He dined alone at a table that rose through the floor from the kitchen below, so that no servant would disturb his solitude. He surrounded himself with music boxes and fountains, spending entire nights wandering through candlelit rooms lost in thought. But his most ambitious dream was Herrenchiemsee, built on an island in the middle of a Bavarian lake. It was meant to be a copy of Versailles, even larger and more magnificent. Ludwig called it his Temple of Glory, dedicated not to God or king, but to art itself. The expenses were staggering. His ministers panicked as debts climbed into the millions. Yet Ludwig ignored their pleas. "It is not my wish to rule men," he said, "but to create for them a world of beauty." His castles became his escape from the world, each one more elaborate, more isolated, and more expensive than the last. While other kings built armies, Ludwig built fantasies. He became a recluse, rarely appearing in public, conducting his affairs through letters and filling his nights with music, candlelight, and solitude. The people of Bavaria adored his creations, even as politicians whispered that their king had lost his mind. To them, he was still the dreamer who built beauty from nothing. But to his ministers, he was becoming a threat, a ruler who no longer ruled, a monarch lost in his own imagination. They began to call him the Mad King. By the early 1880s, King Ludwig II was a ruler in name only. Bavaria's government was run by ministers, generals, and bureaucrats who rarely saw their king, and most of them no longer respected him. Ludwig's debts were enormous. The castles that had once seemed like symbols of beauty now looked like black holes swallowing the treasury. The king had borrowed money from foreign banks and refused to cut back on spending. His ministers pleaded for reason, but he ignored them. When they reminded him of the cost, he replied, "What use is money if it cannot buy beauty?" In their eyes, he had become a liability, a man lost in fantasy, while the rest of Europe raced toward modernity and war. Germany was unifying under Prussian control, and Bavaria's independence was slipping away. The ministers feared Ludwig's instability would destroy what was left of the kingdom's dignity. Then came the final act of betrayal. Behind the walls of Munich's government buildings, Ludwig's advisors began to meet in secret. They spoke in whispers about removing the king from power, but they needed justification, something the people would accept. They decided to declare him insane. In early June 1886, they contacted Dr. Bernhard von Gudden, one of Bavaria's most respected psychiatrists, and ordered him to prepare a medical report. The strange part? Gudden never examined the king in person. Instead, he based his diagnosis entirely on gossip, letters, and the testimonies of servants. The report labelled Ludwig as suffering from paranoia and chronic insanity. It claimed he was dangerous to himself and others. The conclusion was clear. He was unfit to rule. The decision was signed without Ludwig's knowledge. On June 9th, his uncle Prince Luitpold was named regent. The next day, the ministers sent armed men to arrest the king in his own castle. It was the middle of the night when they reached Neuschwanstein. The guards demanded entry, but Ludwig refused to surrender. For hours there was chaos, shouting, threats and confusion echoing through the mountain fortress. At one point, a loyal servant reportedly drew his pistol to defend the king and was shot. The story was later buried, the records conveniently lost. By dawn, Ludwig was taken into custody. The man who had built castles in the clouds was now a prisoner in his own realm. He was transported to Berg Castle, a grey, isolated fortress near Lake Starnberg. He was cut off from his friends, his servants, and his correspondence. Only Dr. Gudden was allowed to see him. Witnesses later said Ludwig remained calm, almost eerily so. He asked for books, for quiet, and for time to walk outside, but he knew what was coming. He told one guard, "They have taken my crown, but soon they will take my life." Those words would prove chillingly prophetic. Over the next 2 days, the ministers waited for the storm of public outrage that never came. Most Bavarians were shocked, but powerless. The newspapers printed the government's version of events, calling the removal of the king a necessary act to preserve the state. In truth, few believed he was truly insane. Many saw him as eccentric, yes, but not dangerous, just a man too gentle and imaginative for the brutal politics of his age. But in politics, perception is everything. And within 72 hours of his arrest, King Ludwig II of Bavaria would be dead. June 13, 1886. Evening fell over Lake Starnberg like a curtain. The air was still, heavy with the scent of pine and rain. Inside Berg Castle, King Ludwig II asked his doctor, Bernhard von Gudden, for a walk. It was the first time he had been allowed outside since his arrest. At precisely 6:30 in the evening, the two men left the castle grounds and began walking along the lake shore. 2 guards followed at a distance, but were ordered by Gudden to remain behind. "The king must have privacy," he said. The sun dipped below the horizon. An hour passed, then another. The light vanished, and the lake turned black. By 9 o'clock, the guards grew nervous. They had not seen the king or the doctor for over an hour. They called out, but there was no reply. When they finally went searching, their lanterns flickering in the wind, they made a horrifying discovery. There, in the shallow waters of Lake Starnberg, lay the bodies of both men. Ludwig's tall frame was floating face down, his coat heavy with water. Nearby was Dr. Gudden, his arms twisted, his face bruised and pale. The official report was released quickly. It claimed that the king had drowned, possibly after attempting to escape, and that the doctor had died trying to save him. The government declared it a tragic accident and ordered immediate burial. But the story never made sense. Ludwig was a strong swimmer who had spent much of his youth in the water. Witnesses who saw his body said there was no water in his lungs, meaning he could not have drowned. Dr. Gudden's body told a different story. Bruises on his neck, blows to his head, and torn clothing, signs of a violent struggle. Even more suspicious, some guards later claimed they heard cries for help and even gunshots coming from the lake that night. But their testimonies disappeared, and the case was closed within 24 hours. The autopsy was conducted in secrecy. Only a handful of officials were allowed to view the results, and the report was never made public in full. Within days, the royal court sealed all of Ludwig's personal letters and diaries. Any documents that could shed light on his final hours were quietly removed or destroyed. The people of Bavaria were stunned. Crowds gathered outside Munich's churches, holding candles and weeping. For them, Ludwig had been more than a king. He was a symbol of beauty, purity, and innocence, a dreamer crushed by the world's cruelty. Rumours spread faster than the government could control. Some said Ludwig had been assassinated to prevent him from reclaiming his throne. Others believed he had discovered the conspiracy against him and was silenced before he could expose it. There were even claims that he had been shot and that his body had been thrown into the lake to disguise the crime. The truth, to this day, remains buried beneath the calm surface of Lake Starnberg. Officially, history recorded it as an accident, but few believed it. The same men who had called him insane were the ones who declared him dead. The same ministers who took his crown now guarded his legacy. And as the bells of Munich tolled for the fallen king, the question echoed across Europe. Had Ludwig II of Bavaria taken his own life, or had his enemies finally finished what they started? Whatever the truth, the fairy tale king was gone, and with him the last trace of innocence in a changing world.